"You look like you wandered into the wrong place, kid. You don't belong here." Sergeant Delphine Parcher's voice carried across the training field. The trainees heard it. A few laughed, the sound sharp, brief, dying quickly against the open space. Mac Werden didn't move. He stood exactly where he was and took it without flinching, without lowering his eyes, without giving Parcher a single thing. What Sergeant Parcher did not know was that he had just picked the one man in the roster who was a third-degree black belt in karate and had spent years learning discipline more than anything else. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you can't miss. The mirror didn't lie. Mac Werden stood in front of it at 5 in the morning, buttoning his white undershirt with slow, deliberate fingers. The bedroom light was harsh and bright. Every crease in his face was visible, every line around his eyes. He looked at himself the way a man looks at something he has been building for a long time. Not with pride, exactly. With readiness. Behind him, on the shelf above the dresser, 3 national championship plaques caught the light. Gold lettering. His name, over and over. He didn't look at them. He already knew what they said. He pulled on his pants, tucked in his undershirt, and stood straight. The man in the mirror looked like he meant business. Mac had wanted to be a police officer since he was 12 years old. Not because the job was glamorous. Not because he grew up watching cop shows on television. He wanted it because of one specific Tuesday afternoon in October, 16 years ago, when his father, Jonathan Werden, a man who wore a suit to the grocery store, who carried a leather briefcase and argued cases in federal court, was pulled over on Meridian Avenue and treated like a criminal. Mac had been in the back seat. He remembered his father's hands, flat on the steering wheel, completely still, knuckles visible. Jonathan hadn't said a word out of line, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't done anything except exist in the wrong car on the wrong street at the wrong time. And the officer had spoken to him like he was nothing. That was the day Mac understood something. Not that the system was broken. His father had been telling him that for years. What he understood, sitting in that back seat at 12 years old, was that broken things could be fixed. But only if someone was willing to get inside them. He turned off the bedroom light. Jonathan was in the kitchen doorway when Mac came down the stairs, coffee in one hand, the other hand hanging loose at his side the way it always did when he was holding something back. Jonathan Werden was 58 years old and had spent 30 of those years fighting in courtrooms for people who had been chewed up by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. He knew exactly what his son was walking into. "You eat anything?" Jonathan asked. "I'll grab something after." Jonathan nodded slowly. He looked at Mac the way Mac had looked at the mirror, like he was calculating something. Then he said quietly, "You know what they'll see when you walk in that door." Mac picked up his keys from the counter. "I know what I'll see when I walk out." Jonathan didn't argue. That was the thing about Jonathan Werden. He knew when a man had already made up his mind. He just watched his son go, coffee warm between both hands now, standing in the kitchen doorway until the front door closed. The drive took 22 minutes. Mac kept both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The city moved past the windows in early morning gray, storefronts with their gates still down, streetlights still on, a delivery truck idling outside a convenience store. Everything quiet and unhurried. Mac drove like he did most things, deliberately, without wasted motion. Precinct 9's Academy Annex sat at the end of a long block on the east side. It was a squat, brick building, old and institutional, with narrow windows and a parking lot that needed repaving. A chain-link fence ran along the left side. A flagpole stood out front with the state and city flags hanging limp in the still morning air. There was nothing welcoming about it. Mac pulled in at 6:57, 3 minutes early. He cut the engine and sat for a moment, scanning the lot. There were already 8 or 9 cars. A few trainees he didn't recognize were walking toward the entrance in small groups, talking in low voices. They wore the standard-issue training uniform, plain white t-shirts and dark navy shorts, the fabric stiff and new-looking against the morning light. It was the same kit waiting on Mac's kitchen chair when he'd packed his bag the night before. He was the only black man he could see. He noticed it the way you notice weather. Not with surprise, exactly. Just acknowledgement. A data point that told him what he already knew about where he was and what was waiting. Mac got out of the car. He straightened himself, picked up his folder of paperwork from the passenger seat, and walked toward the entrance with his head level and his pace steady. The door was heavy. It swung shut behind him with a sound like a verdict. The field was already bright when the trainees assembled, the morning sun cutting hard across the open ground and throwing long shadows off the tree line at the far edge. 11 of them stood in a loose line along the near side of the field, most of them stiff with the particular nervousness of a first morning. All of them in matching white, shirts already showing the heat at the collar, dark shorts uniform down the line. A few looked over when Mac crossed the field to take his place. A couple looked away quickly. He found his spot in the line. He stood straight. He waited. Sergeant Delphine Parcher came around the corner of the annex building like a man who had somewhere more important to be and was doing them a favor by stopping. He was a compact man, not tall, not particularly built, but he moved like someone who had never once been told to wait. 54 years old, with a face that looked like it had been left out in bad weather, creased, reddish, permanently set into something between a squint and a sneer. His uniform was pressed within an inch of its life, the full navy blues of a department sergeant, badge polished to a hard gleam in the morning sun, radio clipped at the shoulder, boots mirror clean against the pale dirt of the field. He looked like a man who used the uniform as a weapon before he opened his mouth. He didn't say good morning. He walked the line slowly, hands clasped behind his back, scanning each trainee from head to foot, the way a man inspects something he already expects to be disappointing. He stopped at the first trainee, a kid of about 22 with slightly scuffed shoes, and stared at the shoes for a full 5 seconds without speaking. The kid's face went red. Around them, the open field offered nowhere to look and no cover to stand behind. Everything was visible out here. That was the point. "You shine those with a dirty sock," Parcher said. Nobody laughed. Nobody breathed. He kept moving. A grunt at the next trainee. A dismissive headshake at the one after that. He was performing, and everyone in the line knew it, and no one was going to say so. The tree line stood still at the edge of the field. The sun climbed and did not care. Then he reached Mac. He stopped. The silence stretched out, more exposed somehow, in the open air than it would have been between 4 walls. Parcher looked Mac up and down once, slowly, like he was reading the back of a cereal box. Then he looked down at his clipboard and dragged his finger along the roster until he found the name. His finger stopped. Worden! He let the name sit in the morning air for a moment. Then he looked up, and there was something in his eyes that wasn't confusion or curiosity. It was a decision. "You look like you wandered onto the wrong field, son. Community center's about 2 blocks north." Laughter broke out immediately. Sharp, quick laughter from Brick Hamilton, a thick-necked trainee at the far end of the line, and 2 others close to him. Out here, it had nowhere to go. It just hung in the open air and faded. Not everyone laughed. Most of the line stayed still, eyes forward. The particular blankness of people who want no part of what they're watching but won't say so either. Mac didn't move. He kept his posture exactly where it was, back straight, chin level. Eyes on the middle distance, fixed on the tree line at the far edge of the field, steady and unchanged, the way he intended to be. He let the laughter run its course, and when it died out into the morning quiet, he said, without any heat in his voice at all, "I appreciate the concern, Sergeant, but I checked the address twice." The laughter stopped. Parcher's expression didn't change. Not exactly, but something behind his eyes shifted. He'd expected embarrassment. He'd expected the flinch, the dropped shoulders, the red face, the mumbled apology. That was the reaction men like Parcher built their whole game around. Out here on the open ground with the sun overhead and nowhere to hide, that flinch was supposed to be inevitable. Mac had given him nothing, just a calm, clear sentence and steady eye contact. Parcher stared at him for one more second. Then he moved on down the line, but his eyes came back to Mac twice before he finished the roster. Mac noticed both times. The morning session was classroom work. Protocols, department regulations, a 40-minute lecture on use of force policy that Parcher delivered like a man who found his own material exhausting. Mac took notes. He stayed focused. The afternoon was different. They moved outside. The training field behind the annex building was wide and flat, bordered on three sides by a dense tree line that stood dark green and still against a sky that had opened up into full aggressive blue. The sun was high and direct, no clouds, no relief, and it hit the pale dirt and scrubbed grass of the field with the particular force of a day that intended to be brutal. The air smelled of dry earth and cut pine from the tree line. It was the kind of afternoon that made everything feel overexposed. The trainees assembled in a loose formation along the near edge of the field. Their white T-shirts caught the sun immediately, already showing sweat at the collar and between the shoulder blades on the trainees who had been moving around setting up equipment. Parcher stood at the center of the field in his full Navy uniform, badge glinting in the direct light, not a button undone, looking entirely unmoved by the heat. His radio crackled once and went quiet. He silenced it without looking down. He called out equipment assignments from his clipboard, turning slowly as he spoke so his voice carried to the far ends of the formation. Trainees received their gear. When he reached Mac, he assigned him the heaviest sandbag pack in the pile, nearly 15 pounds more than the standard issue. He did it without looking up from the clipboard, without explanation. "Equalizing standards," Parcher said flatly, moving on. The run was 3 miles, down the perimeter path that skirted the tree line and doubled back through the open field. The sun tracked them the whole way. No cover on the open stretch, only thin shade where the path cut close to the pines. The white shirts of the group ahead of Mac flashed in and out of the tree shadows like a scattered flock. Mac ran at a steady pace with the extra weight, and finished in the top third of the group, shirt dark with sweat down the spine and across both shoulders, breathing hard but controlled. Parcher clocked the time, wrote something on his board, and said nothing. Then he added a 4th mile, only for Mac, framed as a conditioning variance, and stood at the edge of the field with a stopwatch and his arms folded, watching from beneath the peak of his uniform cap, badge catching the afternoon sun at intervals as he shifted his weight. Mac ran the 4th mile. He didn't complain. He didn't look at Parcher when he crossed the finish line. He just slowed to a walk, controlled his breathing, and rejoined the group. The day ended at 6. Trainees gathered their gear and filed out through the narrow hallway toward the parking lot. Mac was near the back of the group, moving at an easy pace. He heard the footsteps behind him a half-second before it happened. Brick Hamilton hit him with a hard shoulder check as he passed. No words, no eye contact, just a deliberate collision that would have sent most people stumbling into the wall. Mac didn't stumble. He absorbed it, steadied himself in one step, and turned to watch Brick walk away down the hallway, already looking at his phone. Brick never looked back. Mac turned and walked to the exit. Day 2 started the same way Day 1 had ended. Bright lights and Parcher walking the line. But this morning, the 12 trainees were moved back outside before 8 o'clock. The field looked different in the early light. The tree line softer, the shadows long and cool across the near edge of the grass before the sun had climbed enough to burn them off. The trainees assembled in their white t-shirts and dark shorts along the edge of the cleared area, the fabric still carrying the morning chill. A few of them had their arms folded. One was blowing into his hands. Parcher stood at the center of the field in full uniform, badge already catching what sun there was, radio on his shoulder. The navy of his shirt looked almost black in the early morning flat light. He held his clipboard in one hand and looked at the assembled trainees with the expression of a man who had already decided the day was going to disappoint him. "Defensive tactics," he said. "You will be paired. One partner attempts a controlled takedown, the other demonstrates a counter. Resistance," he paused there just briefly, "is encouraged." He worked through the pairings without drama, calling names and pointing. Trainees shuffled into position across the open ground. The dirt and scrubbed grass of the training field had been marked out in a loose rectangle, a makeshift mat area, flat and packed hard from use, with the tree line standing close along the far edge. When he reached Mac's name, he stopped, looked down at the clipboard, then looked up with the thinnest version of a smile Mac had seen on a human face. "Worden." He pointed to the far end of the marked area, closest to the trees. "You're with Hamilton." Brick Hamilton was already moving. He was built like a piece of construction equipment, wide through the shoulders, thick-necked, with hands that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts. He rolled his neck as he walked, cracking it twice, and took his position across from Mac without making eye contact. The sun had climbed enough now to come in flat and direct off the tree line, cutting hard light across the field. Both of them squinted into it. Before the drill began, Parcher walked to Brick's end of the field. He leaned in close to Brick's ear. Whatever he said was too quiet for anyone else to hear. Brick nodded once, slowly, and the corner of his mouth pulled up. Nobody else caught it. But mounted under the narrow eave of the annex building, a security camera pointed at a slight downward angle toward the training field. It caught everything. "Begin," Parcher said. Brick came in fast. Not drill fast, not training fast. He launched himself across the marked ground with his shoulder dropped like a battering ram, driving straight at Mac's chest with the kind of force that was meant to end the exercise in the first 3 seconds. Mac sidestepped. It wasn't a dramatic move. There was no spin, no leap, no sound. He simply wasn't where Brick expected him to be, and Brick's momentum carried him past. The dry grass scuffed under his boots as he stumbled forward. Brick recovered, turned, reset, came again. This time a forearm shot up toward Mac's throat, hard enough to bruise, hard enough to send a clear message about what kind of drill this actually was. Mac caught the arm at the wrist, redirected it with a small, precise rotation, and used Brick's own forward drive against him. Brick hit the ground on his back with a sound like a heavy door slamming, dirt puffing up around him in the afternoon light. The group went quiet. A few trainees in their white shirts stood with arms at their sides, watching. The sun was fully up now, the field bleached pale and shadowless. Brick got up. His jaw was tight. He looked at Parcher once, fast, almost involuntary, and Parcher's face gave him nothing. Just watching, arms folded across his navy chest, badge glinting, cap brim level in the sun. Brick reset. The third attempt was slower, more deliberate. He came in low, going for a leg grab, a wrestler's move, hard to counter without training. Mac let him close the distance, then dropped his weight and shifted his hips in one smooth motion, redirecting Brick's grip and using the angle to bring him forward and down. Brick hit the ground again, harder this time, face first into the packed dirt. He lay there for a moment. The field was absolutely silent. No shuffling feet. No clipboard scratching. The tree line stood motionless at the far edge. The only sound was the distant drone of a passing car somewhere behind the building. And then, nothing. Brick pushed himself up slowly, one arm at a time. There was a red mark spreading across his left cheekbone, where it had met the ground. He got to his feet and stood there, breathing through his nose, a streak of pale dirt across the front of his white t-shirt. Mac stood in the center of the field. His breathing was even. His undershirt was damp across the shoulders, from the sun, from the run, from the same effort that had bent every other man in the group. But he hadn't raised his voice, hadn't thrown a single aggressive move, hadn't done anything except be exactly where Brick wasn't, and use the energy that came at him to answer itself. 16 years of training. Every early morning, every competition, every hour on the mat. It had all lived quietly inside him, waiting for a moment exactly like this one. He turned and looked directly at Parche. "I believe the drill is complete, Sergeant." Parcher didn't move. His arms were still folded, badge steady in the afternoon light. His face was still controlled. But something behind his eyes had shifted. The same shift Mac had noticed yesterday. Only deeper now. More deliberate. This was no longer casual cruelty. This was a man making a decision. Around them, 11 trainees stood in their white shirts, without speaking. Danica Opstal, third from the left, stared at Mac with wide eyes and said nothing. Nobody said anything. Somewhere in the tree line, a single bird called once, sharply, and went quiet. That night, the light in Parcher's office burned late. He sat behind his desk with a blank incident report form on the surface in front of him and a coffee going cold at his elbow. The room was small and cluttered. Filing cabinets along one wall, a framed commendation from 2009 hanging slightly crooked above the door, stacks of training binders on every flat surface. He'd been in this office for 8 years. It looked like a man who had stopped trying to impress anyone a long time ago. He picked up his pen. He wrote slowly and carefully, the way a man writes when he knows the words matter. Not a rant, not a complaint fired off in anger. Something precise, something that would hold up. He had done this before. The phrasing came to him without much effort, like a recipe he had memorized years ago and never needed to look up again. Trainee Warden, Mac. Unauthorized and excessive use of force during controlled defensive tactics exercise. Training partner sustained injury. Conduct inconsistent with academy standards. Recommend immediate suspension pending review. He read it back once. Then he signed it. Mac arrived at the academy at 6:54 the next morning, day 3, 3 minutes earlier than the day before. A junior administrator named Filson was waiting for him outside the entrance. Young, maybe 25, with the look of someone who had drawn the short straw and knew it. He was holding a manila folder and standing just far enough from the door that it was clear he didn't want to be seen doing what he was about to do. "Mr. Warden," Filson cleared his throat, "I need to speak with you before you go inside." Mac stopped. He looked at the folder. He looked at Filson. "There's been a complaint filed regarding yesterday's training exercise." Filson opened the folder and stared at it rather than at Mac. "Pending an incident review, you've been suspended from the training rotation. With pay. Effective immediately." The words landed flat in the cold morning air. Mac didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He asked one question. "Who filed the complaint?" Filson hesitated just long enough to answer the question without answering it. "The review process will—" "I understand," Mac said. He didn't go inside. There was nothing inside for him anymore. Not today. Filson walked him. though walked with him was more accurate, the man couldn't look him in the eye. Back to the parking lot. The door to the building opened once during the walk, and 3 trainees spilled out, cutting off when they saw what was happening. Danica Opstal was among them. He stopped at the top of the steps and watched Mac reach his car. He watched the longest. Mac sat in the driver's seat with the engine off. He didn't call his father. Not yet. He pulled the copy of the complaint Filson had handed him from the folder and read it in full, slowly, in the morning quiet of the parking lot. It was clean. That was the first thing he noticed. No anger in the language, no exaggeration. Just the kind of measured institutional wording that looks, to someone who doesn't know better, like objectivity. Brick Hamilton was referenced only as training partner. Parcher's pre-drill instruction to Brick, that quiet lean-in that the whole field had registered and nobody had spoken about, was absent entirely. Mac's measured, controlled response was described as an unprovoked escalation. He read it a second time. Then he looked at the top right corner of the form, the case reference number. It was a string of letters and digits that looked like noise to most people. To Mac, something about it snagged. He pulled out his phone and opened the department's public incident registry, a database his father had shown him years ago, used primarily for civil litigation research. He typed in the reference prefix from his complaint. 4 results came back. His was the most recent. The 3 before it shared the same prefix code, the same form template, the same spare clinical language. Different names, different dates, spread across the last 7 years. He stared at the screen for a long time. Same prefix, same structure, same author, he was almost certain. His phone buzzed in his hand. Unknown number. A text, 4 words, and a question mark. They've done this before. 3 others before you. Can we talk? Mac looked up from the phone and stared through the windshield at the Academy building. The brick face of it. The narrow windows. The flag limp on its pole. He looked back down at the text. He saved the number. And he began to type. The diner was 12 blocks from the precinct. That had been Mac's condition. 12 blocks minimum. Far enough that no one from the Academy would recognize a face through the window and start asking questions. Danica had agreed without hesitation, which told Mac something about how scared the man already was. Danica Opstal was 26, lean, with careful eyes that moved to the door every time it opened. He was already in the booth when Mac arrived. Back to the wall, coffee untouched, hands wrapped around the mug like he needed something to hold on to. He was still in his civilian clothes. He'd come straight from home, not from the Academy. Mac slid into the seat across from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The diner hummed around them, the clatter of plates, a television above the counter showing morning news with the volume low, the smell of bacon grease and burnt coffee. Normal sounds. Normal morning. Nothing about it matched what they were sitting down to discuss. Danica spoke first. "I shouldn't be here," he said. "I know," Mac said. "Tell me anyway." Danica didn't have much. He was clear about that from the start. He had fragments, impressions, things he had picked up from the margins of conversations he wasn't supposed to be part of. But fragments, Mac had learned from his father, were how the picture started. 3 trainees before Mac, all black, all formally complained against within their first 2 weeks under Parcher. All processed out quietly, efficiently, with no public record of dispute. Danica had picked up the information in pieces, a comment from a second-year officer who'd gone through the Academy 4 years ago, an offhand remark from a building administrator that stopped short when Danica walked into the room, a name mentioned once, and never again. One of them had been a woman. "Do you have names?" Mac asked. Danica shook his head. "Just what I told you, and the numbers you already found." Mac nodded. That was enough for now. He left Danica to his untouched coffee, paid for both of them at the counter, and drove home. He called his father that evening. Jonathan picked up on the second ring, which meant he'd been waiting for it. Mac read the case reference numbers slowly and clearly, the way his father had taught him to relay information. No editorializing, no interpretation, just the facts in order. Jonathan listened without interrupting. When Mac finished, there was a brief silence that wasn't emptiness. It was the sound of a mind already working. "Give me until tomorrow morning," Jonathan said. Jonathan called back at 7:42 the next morning. Mac was at the kitchen table with a notepad and a pen already in front of him. He'd been up since 6. "I cross-referenced the prefix codes through the civil filing registry and the department's public complaint archive," Jonathan said. His voice had the particular quality it got when he was delivering findings. Measured, precise, no wasted words. 3 prior complaints. Same form template. Same reference structure. Filed over a 7-year span. "Names," Mac said. "Ryden Oliver. Filed 6 years ago. Processed out within 3 weeks. Last known address puts him out of state. No current contact information in any database I can access." A pause. "Trevor Flaherty. 4 years ago. He's local. Listed address on the east side, phone number attached to the record." Mac wrote both names. "And the third?" "Kyla Delzer. 2.5 years ago." Another pause, slightly longer this time. "Mac, she fought it. Hired an attorney. The complaint record has a response filing attached. A formal dispute. It went nowhere, but she tried." Mac wrote her name. He underlined it once, without thinking about it. "That's 3 documented cases," he said. "Same sergeant. Same complaint structure. Same outcome. In 7 years," Jonathan said. "And those are only the ones that made it into a filing system I can access. There may be more that were handled before any paperwork was generated." Max stared at the 3 names on his notepad. Ryden Oliver, Trevor Flaherty, Kyla Delzer. Real people. Real careers. Ended or derailed before they had the chance to begin. And behind each name, the same signature at the bottom of the same kind of form. "Dad." He kept his voice even. "This wasn't personal. What he did to me." "No," Jonathan said. He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was low and deliberate. "Mac, these aren't accidents. Parcher built himself a process." Mac looked at the 3 names for a long time after he hung up. Then he picked up his pen and drew a line connecting all of them. Jonathan Worden did not send the complaint by mail. He drove it to the department's HR division himself, parked in the visitor lot, walked through the front entrance with the document in a sealed envelope, and stood at the reception desk until a clerk signed for it and stamped the acknowledgement copy with the date and time. 8:41 in the morning. He kept the stamped copy, folded it into his inside jacket pocket, and drove back to his office. He had been doing this for 30 years. He knew better than to leave a paper trail with gaps in it. 2 days passed. Max spent them at home, suspended and barred from the building, doing what his father had taught him to do with waiting time. He organized. He built a timeline on his kitchen table using index cards and a roll of tape, placing every event in order, every name, every date, every case reference number. He read the department's HR policy manual cover to cover and found 3 separate procedures that Parcher's complaint against him had bypassed without explanation. On the morning of the 3rd day, a letter arrived at Jonathan's office by department courier. Jonathan read it standing at his desk. The complaint had been reviewed and found to be without merit. The matter was considered closed. No further action would be taken. He read it again. Then he set it down on his desk and stood very still for a moment. In 30 years of civil rights law, he had seen complaints buried in many ways, delayed, misfiled, lost in reassignment. But this letter had arrived in 48 hours. 48 hours, from receipt to closure, with no record of a single interview conducted, no request for documentation, no contact with Mac, no contact with Jonathan. That wasn't slowness. That wasn't bureaucracy doing what bureaucracy does. That was a door being shut before anyone could get a foot in it. Jonathan called Mac and told him what the letter said. Mac listened without speaking. Then he said, "Who signed it?" Jonathan looked at the bottom of the letter. HR Administrator. Name's Gavin Foss. Mac wrote the name on a fresh index card and added it to the table. That afternoon, Mac drove to the east side. Brighton Oliver's last known address was a second-floor apartment in a building with a broken buzzer panel and a landlord who answered the door in a bathrobe. He confirmed that Raiden had moved out 14 months ago. Forwarding address? He laughed like Mac had asked something funny. No forwarding address, no contact, just gone. Mac sat in his car outside the building for a minute. Then he drove away. Trevor Flaherty answered on the third ring. His voice was careful right from the start. Not unfriendly, but measured in the way of a man who had decided in advance how far this conversation was going to go. Mac introduced himself, explained what had happened, explained what he and his father had found about the pattern of complaints. He kept it brief and factual. Silence on the line. Then, "I hear you. I do. But I've got a wife and 2 kids and a job I can't afford to lose. I'm done with all of it. Whatever happened, happened. I moved on." "Trevor, I'm not doing this, man." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The exhaustion in it said everything. "I'm sorry about what they did to you. I really am. But I can't go back there. I can't." The line went quiet. "Okay," Mac said. "I understand." He meant it. That was the hardest part. He actually meant it. Trevor Flaherty had every reason in the world to say no, and no obligation to say yes, and being angry at a man for protecting his family was not something Mac was willing to do. But the silence after he hung up sat in the car with him for a long time. He dialed Kyla Delzer last. It rang 4 times. He was preparing for voicemail when she picked up. Yes? Cautious. A woman who didn't recognize the number and wasn't pretending otherwise. Mac told her his name, told her what precinct, told her what Parcher had done and what his father had found. The line went quiet. Not the silence of someone who didn't care. The silence of someone who cared very much and was deciding something important. When she spoke, her voice was steady and clear. "Tell me what you need." Mac set his phone down on the kitchen table. In front of him, the notepad with the 3 names sat under the index card timeline he'd been building for 2 days. He looked at the names for a moment. Then he picked up his pen and circled Kyla's name. Jonathan Weirden's law office was on the 4th floor of a building that smelled like old wood and legal paper. It was a serious room. Dark bookshelves floor to ceiling, a wide desk that had seen 30 years of hard cases, 2 chairs across from it that had held a lot of people at the worst moments of their lives. Mac had grown up coming to this office. To him, it felt like a place where the truth was taken seriously. Kyla Delzer arrived 15 minutes early. She was 34, with close-cropped natural hair and the kind of posture that came from years of military discipline. Back straight, shoulders level, chin up. She wore a dark jacket and carried nothing but her phone and her keys. She took the chair closest to the wall, with her back to the bookshelf and a clear line of sight to the door, and she sat with her hands folded in her lap and waited. Mac noticed the chair she'd chosen. He understood it. He sat across from her. Jonathan took his place behind the desk. For a moment, the 3 of them just looked at each other. The quiet before something heavy gets put on the table. Then Kyla said, "How bad did they get you?" Mac told her. All of it, in order. The first day. Parcher's comment in the line, the drill on the training field, Brick, the complaint, the suspension, the buried HR filing. The letter signed by Gavin Foss that had come back in 48 hours without a single interview. Kyla listened without moving. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Same. Almost exactly the same." She had been 29 when she entered the academy. Former Army medic, 2 deployments, an honorable discharge, and a criminal justice degree she'd earned online while still in service. She had wanted to be a detective, specifically a crimes against persons detective, the kind who worked cases nobody else wanted to touch. She had a plan. She had been working toward it for 6 years before she walked through the doors of Precinct 9's Academy Annex. Parcher had started on day 1. The same way, the comment in the line, the dismissal dressed up as a joke, the laughter from the people around him. She hadn't flinched either, which she now understood was what made her a target. 2 weeks in, during a firearms training exercise, Parcher filed a complaint stating that Kyla had discharged her training weapon in an unsafe manner, endangering the officers around her. 3 other trainees had been standing within 10 feet of her when it supposedly happened. Not one of them said it was true. "I talked to 2 of them afterward," Kyla said. "Both of them told me privately that nothing happened, that I had followed every protocol exactly right. Both of them also told me they wouldn't put it in writing." She paused. "I didn't blame them then. I don't blame them now. Parcher had 8 years in that building. They had 2 weeks. She fought the complaint for 8 months. She hired an attorney with money she had saved over 2 years. She filed a formal dispute, submitted her own documentation, requested the testimony of the officers who had been present. Every request was either delayed or denied. The union's representative met with her once, in a conference room on the 2nd floor of the precinct. He was a heavy-set man with a friendly handshake who smiled all the way through the meeting. At the end of it, he leaned back in his chair and said, almost gently, "The union supports its officers. You're not an officer yet." That was it. No appeal, no hearing, no accountability. 8 months of fighting, and that was the sentence she got. 4 words. Kyla finished speaking and sat very still. She wasn't crying. She was past that. But the anger in her face was so old and so settled that it had become something else, something harder and more permanent than anger. Mac had not moved during any of it. His phone buzzed on the edge of the desk. He glanced at it. Danica, texting from inside the academy. He read the message, and his jaw tightened. He turned the phone so Kyla could read the screen. Danica's text said that Parcher had spent the morning on the training field telling the remaining trainees, out there in the full sun, in their white shirts and dark shorts, while he stood in his pressed uniform with his arms folded, that Mac had assaulted Brick without provocation, and that the department was taking action to protect the training program from people like him. It also said that Brick was walking around the facility with visible bruises on his forearm. Kyla read the message. She looked up. "They're building the story they need," she said quietly. Mac held her gaze. "Then we build ours first." The call came into Jonathan Worden's office on a Tuesday afternoon. His assistant put it through with a single note. "Journalist, says it's about Precinct 9. And Jonathan picked up the receiver the way he picked up every unexpected call. Carefully, with nothing in his voice that wasn't deliberate. "Mr. Worden." The voice on the other end was clear and direct. No warm-up, no small talk. "My name is Pammy Oliver. I'm an investigative journalist with the Regional Observer. I've been tracking Sergeant Delphin Parcher for 14 months. I think we need to talk." Jonathan sat forward in his chair. "Oliver," he said slowly. "Raiden is my brother," she said. "Yes." Pammy came to the office the following morning. She was compact, sharp-eyed, and moved like someone who was always slightly ahead of the conversation she was in. She carried a laptop bag and an accordion folder thick with printed documents, and she set both on Jonathan's desk without being asked. Mac sat to one side, saying little, watching her work. She had started following Parcher's trail 8 months after Ryden was processed out of the academy. When Ryden finally told her, in pieces, what had actually happened. She hadn't gone to print immediately. She was too careful for that. Instead, she had spent 14 months building, collecting public records, cross-referencing complaint filings, identifying patterns, tracking the demographics of every trainee who had entered Parcher's program and failed to complete it. The numbers were not subtle. In 8 years of running the training program, Parcher had filed formal complaints against 9 trainees. 7 of them were black. All 7 were processed out. The 2 white trainees who received complaints, both for documented, witnessed infractions, had been given remediation plans and completed the program. 7-0. Mac looked at the number on Pammy's printed spreadsheet for a long time. "I have Mac's case," she told Jonathan. "I have the complaint, the suspension timeline, the 48-hour HR closure. I have Kyla Delzer. She agreed to be named. And I have the demographic breakdown going back 8 years." She paused. "What I don't have is someone on the inside. Someone who can speak to what they personally witnessed." Jonathan looked at Mac. Mac thought about Danica, still inside the building, still showing up every morning, texting from an unknown number because he was afraid to use his own. He thought about what it would cost Danica to go on record. He thought about what it would cost him not to. "Let me make a call," Mac said. Danica agreed to provide a written account of what he had witnessed during the field drill. The pre-exercise exchange between Parcher and Brick's deliberate escalation out on the open training ground, and Mac's controlled response. He would not attach his name to it. Not yet. But he would put it in writing and let Pammy use it as background sourcing. It was enough. Pammy's article went up on the Regional Observer's website on a Thursday evening. It was long, over 2,000 words, carefully sourced, precise in its language, and devastating in its implications. It named Parcher. It named the 7 trainees. It quoted Kyla Delzer directly. It laid out the 8-year demographic pattern in a table that required no interpretation. It did not editorialize. It did not have to. By midnight, it had been shared 4,000 times. By the following morning, 11,000. The police chief's office called Jonathan at 9:15. The statement came through an hour later, released simultaneously to every major outlet in the region. Sergeant Delphine Parcher would be placed on administrative leave effective immediately, pending a formal review board hearing. Trainee Brick Hamilton had been removed from the training facility. The department was committed to a full and transparent review of all related complaints. Jonathan read the statement aloud to Mac over the phone. Mac was in his living room. He sat on the couch and listened to every word, and when Jonathan finished, he didn't say anything immediately. He just sat there with the phone against his ear and the afternoon light coming through the window and let himself feel it. The specific, complicated relief of being believed, of having the thing you know to be true acknowledged by the people who had been pretending otherwise. It lasted about 30 seconds. Then his father said, "It's a good first step, not the finish line." Mac knew that. Jonathan had been in this business too long to mistake a press release for a verdict. "I know," Mac said, but when he hung up the phone, he sat quietly for another moment before he moved. For the first time in days, there was warmth somewhere in his chest. Mac's phone started ringing at 2 in the morning. He was asleep when the first call came in. He rolled over, saw his father's name on the screen, and was sitting upright before the second ring finished. Jonathan never called at 2 in the morning. In 28 years, Mac could not remember a single time it had happened. He answered, "They leaked your juvenile record." Jonathan's voice was controlled, but only the way a fire is controlled when it's still burning. "It's up on the Precinct Insider. Posted about 40 minutes ago." Mac said nothing. "Mac, I'm here." He was already moving to his laptop. "What does it say?" The Precinct Insider was a news site that called itself independent and functioned as a mouthpiece for the police union. Everyone in the city knew what it was. Everyone read it anyway. The headline took up the full width of the screen. "Academy's victim has history of violence. Sealed records reveal assault charge." Mac read it once, then again. The article was short, barely 400 words, but it was surgical. It outlined the incident from 16 years ago. Mac, then 16, had been involved in a physical altercation with 3 older boys. He had defended himself. The aggravated assault charge had been filed, reviewed, and dropped within 60 days. The record had been sealed by court order. Every one of those facts was in the article. Accessing a sealed juvenile record through a law enforcement database without legal cause was a federal violation. The Precinct Insider had not accessed it themselves. They didn't have that kind of reach. Someone inside the department had pulled the record and handed it over. Mac closed the laptop. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark and breathed. By morning, the damage was visible and total. The review board chair issued a brief statement before 9 o'clock. Given the emergence of new information and the current media environment, the hearing scheduled for the following 48 hours would be postponed indefinitely. No new date was provided. Jonathan called Pammy Oliver's editor directly. The conversation was short. The editor, citing pressure from 2 of the paper's largest advertisers, both of whom had documented ties to the police union, had made a decision overnight. Pammy's article was being pulled from the site pending what the editor called independent verification. The article that had been shared 11,000 times was gone by 10 in the morning, replaced with a gray placeholder box and a single line about editorial review. Pammy called Mac herself, furious and apologizing at the same time. He told her it wasn't her fault. He meant it, but the words felt thin in his mouth. The chief's office released a new statement at noon. It was 3 sentences long. It affirmed Parcher's 22 years of exemplary service to the department. It expressed confidence in the integrity of the training program. It said nothing about the review board postponement. 22 years of exemplary service. Mac read those 4 words 3 times. Kyla Delzer stopped answering texts that afternoon. Mac sent 2. Neither delivered. He didn't push. He understood. When the wall pushes back this hard, people who have already been hurt by it once don't stay in the open. Kyla had a life, a career she had rebuilt from nothing after Parcher dismantled her first one. He couldn't ask her to stand in front of a moving vehicle twice. Trevor Flaherty's number was disconnected. Whether he'd changed it recently or months ago, Mac had no way of knowing. Danica sent a single text at 3 in the afternoon from his unknown number. 2 words and a period. "I'm sorry." Mac set his phone face down on the kitchen table and left it there. He was still sitting at that table when his father arrived at 6, without calling ahead, with 2 cups of coffee from the place on Meridian that Mac had liked since he was a kid. Jonathan set one in front of him and sat down across from him and didn't try to smooth anything over. "They committed a federal crime to stop you," Jonathan said. "Accessing a sealed juvenile record without cause. That's not a policy violation. That's a criminal act. I know. Which means they're scared." Mac wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. The warmth of it moved into his palms. Outside the kitchen window, the evening had gone fully dark. "Doesn't feel that way right now," he said. "No," Jonathan said. He didn't pretend otherwise. "It doesn't." They sat together in the quiet kitchen for a long time, the notepad with the 3 names still on the table between them, and neither of them said anything more. Jonathan was back at 7 the next morning. Mac hadn't slept much. He'd been up since 5, sitting at the same kitchen table with the same notepad, running the same loop through his head. The leak, the postponed hearing, the pulled article, the chief's statement. 22 years of exemplary service. He had the whole thing memorized now, every piece of it, the way you memorize something that keeps you awake. When Jonathan knocked, Mac was already at the door. His father came in carrying his leather briefcase, moving with a different quality than he'd carried the night before. Last night Jonathan had come as a father, steady, present, not pretending the damage wasn't real. This morning he came as an attorney. The briefcase hit the kitchen table with a solid sound, and Jonathan was already unclipping it before he sat down. "I've been up since 4, Jonathan said. "Let me tell you what I see." Mac sat across from him and listened. Jonathan opened with the facts, laid out flat and clean. The leak was not just a dirty move. It was a criminal act with a specific federal statute attached to it. Accessing sealed juvenile records through a law enforcement database without documented legal cause violated both state privacy law and federal juvenile justice protection codes. Whoever had pulled that record had used a law enforcement login to do it, which meant there was a database access trail, a timestamp, a username, a chain of custody that led directly back to a person sitting at a computer inside the department. "They handed us something," Jonathan said. "They panicked, and they handed us something they cannot take back." He pulled a legal pad from the briefcase, already filled with notes in his small, precise handwriting. "I'm filing an emergency motion this morning demanding a full investigation into the source of the record's access. That motion goes to the court and simultaneously to 2 other places." He tapped the pad with his pen. "The State Attorney General's office and the U.S. Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division." Mac looked at him. "The DOJ. The moment this became a federal records violation committed in the context of a civil rights complaint, it stopped being a local department matter." Jonathan's voice was steady and matter-of-fact, the way it got when he was certain. "They can't bury a DOJ inquiry the way Foss buried the HR complaint. They don't have the reach for that." Mac sat back in his chair. He turned this over carefully, the way his father had taught him to examine an argument, looking for the weakness before committing to it. He couldn't find one. "Do it," he said. Jonathan filed the emergency motion from his office at 9:45 that morning, while Mac sat across the desk and watched him sign the documents. The notifications to the AG's office and the DOJ Civil Rights Division went out simultaneously by certified electronic filing, time-stamped and receipted. It felt, Mac thought, like a different kind of drill. They were back at Jonathan's office at 3 in the afternoon when the phone rang. Jonathan's assistant put the call through with a short knock on the doorframe and a look on her face that Mac couldn't quite read. Jonathan picked up. He listened for about 10 seconds without speaking, and then he said, "Hold on, please," and put the call on speaker. "Captain Morales." His voice gave nothing away. "My son is here with me. Please, go ahead." The voice on the other end was measured and deliberate, a woman who had decided exactly what she was going to say before she dialed. "Mr. Worden, I'm going to keep this brief. I am a captain at Precinct 9. I have been documenting Sergeant Parcher's conduct for 3 years. I have personnel records, cross-referenced HR filings, and 14 hours of security camera footage from inside the Academy training facility." A pause. "I have been waiting for a case that could carry the weight of what I have. I believe your son is that case. I'd like to meet." The office went very still. Mac leaned forward slightly, both forearms on the desk. 14 hours. Security cameras covering the training facility, the field, the open ground. Parcher leaning close to Brick before the drill began. Jonathan looked at Mac across the desk. Mac gave a single nod. "We're available tomorrow morning," Jonathan said into the phone. "Our office, 8 o'clock. "I'll be there," Morales said, and the line went quiet. Jonathan set the phone down slowly. He looked at his son. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Jonathan said, "We just found the foundation." Captain Esther Morales arrived at 8 o'clock exactly. She came alone. No assistant, no union representative, no attorney. She checked the hallway in both directions before stepping through the door, and she pulled it shut behind her herself, rather than letting it close on its own. She was 47, Latina, with dark hair pulled back tight, and the kind of face that had learned a long time ago not to show everything it was thinking. She wore plain clothes, dark slacks, a gray jacket, nothing that identified her as department. She was carrying a sealed external hard drive in one hand and a bound folder of documents in the other. Jonathan stood to greet her. Mac stayed seated and watched her cross the room. She moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had spent decades inside an institution that punished visible emotion. She set the hard drive and the folder on Jonathan's desk like she was setting down something she had been carrying for a very long time. She took the chair across from Jonathan and looked at Mac directly. "I want you to know something before we start," she said. "I'm not doing this because of your case specifically. I'm doing this because I've watched this happen for 3 years, and I've been waiting for a case the system couldn't quietly swallow. Yours is the one." Mac held her gaze. "I understand." "Good," she said, and she opened the folder. Morales started with the cameras. The Academy Annex had security cameras covering the exterior training areas, as well as the building's interior. The camera mounted beneath the rear eave, the one angled out over the training field, had been positioned primarily to monitor the equipment shed and the near section of the perimeter fence. What Parcher had never verified was its horizontal sweep. The camera's field of view extended across the full width of the drill area at a slight diagonal. It captured the field, the formation, the tree line at the far edge. It had captured everything. Morales opened the hard drive on Jonathan's laptop. The footage was clear and time-stamped. She navigated to the file without hesitation. She had watched it enough times to know exactly where it lived. The training field appeared on screen. The trainees in their white shirts and dark shorts, assembled in the morning sun. The tree line behind them dark and still. Then Parcher, in his full Navy uniform, moving across the frame toward Brick Hamilton before the drill began, his badge catching the light. He leaned in close. 2 seconds, maybe 3, and his mouth moved. Brick nodded once. The corner of Brick's mouth pulled up. Then Parcher stepped back and called the drill to begin. Nobody in the room spoke. Mac watched the screen. He watched himself on the footage, the controlled movement on the packed dirt field, the redirections, Brick hitting the ground 3 times while dust puffed up around them, and Parcher stood with his arms folded and the tree line framed the whole scene behind him. He watched himself stand in the center of the field at the end of it, uniform barely disturbed. He watched Parcher's jaw tighten in the high summer light. He had lived through that moment once already. Watching it from the outside was something different entirely. Jonathan leaned forward. "The pre-drill instruction is audible?" "No," Morales said. "The camera doesn't carry sound, but lip readers aren't necessary." She pointed at the screen. The instruction, the nod, Hamilton's response, and then what follows. The footage tells the story without a single word of audio. She closed the video and opened the folder. The documents were 3 years of careful, methodical work. Morales had cross-referenced every formal complaint filed through the Academy training program against the HR administrator who processed them. The name appeared on every single Parcher-related filing. Gavin Foss. The same name on Mac's buried HR complaint. The same name on the letter that had come back in 48 hours without a single interview. Morales had gone further. She had obtained the department's social club registry, a voluntary internal document listing officer participation in departmental recreational groups. Parcher and Foss were both listed as members of the Weekend Golf League. Documented attendance records showed them present at the same outings on 14 separate occasions over the past 2 years. Jonathan read through the documents without speaking. His pen moved steadily across his legal pad. "Foss accessed my son's sealed juvenile record," he said, not looking up. "The AG's office will confirm it," Morales said. "His login credentials are on the database access trail. It's already there. They just need to pull it." Jonathan set his pen down. He looked at the hard drive sitting on his desk. Then he looked at Morales. "This ends Parcher," he said. Morales looked back at him without blinking. "It ends more than Parcher," she said. The clip was 12 seconds long. Pammy Oliver posted it from her personal journalism page the morning after Morales's meeting at the law office. No article attached, just the clip, a timestamp, and a single line of caption. Security footage from outside Precinct 9's Academy training facility. Sergeant Delphin Parcher. Moments before the drill. 12 seconds of Parcher, in full Navy uniform, leaning close to Brick Hamilton's ear out on the sunlit field. The tree line at the edge of the frame. The other trainees in white shirts standing in formation behind them. Brick nodding. The corner of Brick's mouth pulling up. 12 seconds. And by noon, it had been viewed 40,000 times. Mac's phone started going off mid-morning, and didn't stop. He sat at the kitchen table and watched the notification count climb. Shares, comments, messages from numbers he didn't recognize. Journalists, community advocates, a retired officer who had worked Precinct 9 12 years ago and wanted to talk. He responded to none of them. That wasn't his job. His father's office would handle the press. Mac's job right now was to stay focused and wait. His phone buzzed with a call at 2:15 in the afternoon. A number he recognized. Kyla Delzer. He picked up before the second ring. "I watched it," she said. No greeting, no preamble. "I watched it 6 times. And?" "That's what he did before my incident." Her voice was steady but tight, like a wire pulled almost to its limit. The lean, the whisper. "I was on the other side of the field during my exercise, and I saw him do it to the officer running my drill. I told my attorney." She said, without audio, it meant nothing. A short pause. "I never stopped thinking about that moment. 6 times I watched your footage, and I still couldn't breathe right." Mac said nothing. He let her have the space. "I'll testify," Kyla said. "Whatever you need. Deposition, hearing, courtroom, wherever this goes, I'm there. Full name, on the record, everything." Jonathan filed the amendment to the federal civil rights lawsuit that same afternoon, formally incorporating Kyla's testimony into the case structure. What had begun as a single incident complaint against Delphin Parcher was now something larger and more difficult to dismiss. A documented pattern of racially discriminatory conduct spanning multiple victims, multiple years, and multiple levels of institutional complicity. The legal term was class action. The human term was they had all been lied about in the same way by the same man, while the same system looked the other way. Danica Opstall submitted his written statement that evening, still without his name attached, but detailed, chronological, and corroborating every element of Mac's account of the drill. Jonathan noted it carefully and told Danica that when he was ready to attach his name, the door was open. Danica didn't respond to that, but he didn't close the door either. That evening, after the calls and the filings and the noise of the day had settled, Mac and his father sat together in the law office. The hard drive sat on the desk between them. The folder of Morales's documentation sat beside it. The legal pad with Jonathan's notes was filled front and back, multiple pages deep now, the handwriting getting smaller and more compressed as the case got larger and more certain. Mac had been quiet for a while. Not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say. The quiet of someone who was deciding whether to say the real thing. "I want you to know something," he said. Jonathan looked up from the legal pad. "I'm not doing this because of what Parcher did to me." Mac kept his voice level. "I mean, I am, but that's not why I'm sitting here at 8 o'clock on a Thursday night. I'm doing this because the next person who walks into that building on their first day—" He stopped. Started again. "They don't deserve what I got. They don't deserve what Kyla got. Or Ryden. Or Trevor." He paused. "I got lucky. I had you. Most people don't have a Jonathan Worden waiting at home to run case reference numbers at 7 in the morning. Most people just get processed out and disappear." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. He set his pen down on the legal pad. He looked at his son across the desk. This man he had raised, who had walked into the worst version of the machine he had spent his whole life fighting, and come out the other side still standing, still clear-eyed, still talking about other people. "That," Jonathan said slowly, "is exactly why I became a lawyer." The office was quiet around them. Evening light had gone from gold to gray outside the windows. The hard drive sat between them like a verdict that had already been rendered, just waiting on the paperwork. Mac looked at his father. For the first time since day one, he felt the ground beneath him as solid. The federal building on Court Street was nothing like the precinct. It was clean and tall and indifferent to everyone who walked through it. Marble floors, fluorescent lighting, security desks staffed by people who had seen everything and reacted to nothing. Mac and Jonathan arrived 40 minutes early and sat in the corridor outside the hearing room in wooden chairs that had probably held 1,000 people carrying 1,000 different kinds of trouble. Mac sat straight, hands folded, eyes forward. 3 weeks had passed since Morales's meeting at the law office. 3 weeks of depositions, filings, document requests, and the slow, grinding preparation that Jonathan had always described as building a wall one brick at a time. Mac had spent most of it waiting. Waiting was, he had decided, the hardest part of the whole thing. Harder than day one. Harder than the complaint. Harder even than the night the tabloid story went up. Waiting meant thinking. Thinking meant going back through every moment and wondering if it was going to be enough. At 8:55, Jonathan put a hand briefly on Mac's shoulder. "It's enough," he said, as if he'd heard the thought. The hearing room held a long table at the front, where 3 federal panel members sat with water glasses and thick document folders. A court reporter was already typing. Pammy Oliver sat in the public gallery with 2 other journalists Mac didn't recognize. Department legal counsel occupied a table to the left. Parcher sat beside his attorney in a charcoal suit, back straight, face arranged into something that was trying hard to look like dignity. Mac took his seat and did not look at Parcher. Morales testified first. She stood at the front of the room with the bound folder of documentation and walked the panel through 3 years of work with the same calm precision she had brought to Jonathan's office. She named dates, referenced case numbers, connected Gavin Foss to every Parcher-related HR filing with documented specificity. She presented the demographic breakdown: 7 black trainees complained against, 7 processed out, 0 remediation plans offered, and laid it against the 2 white trainees who had received complaints and been given second chances. The panel chair asked no questions during Morales's testimony. He took notes throughout. Then the footage played. Jonathan had arranged for it to be displayed on the room's presentation screen. The outdoor training field appeared, the pale dirt and scrubbed grass in the afternoon sun, the tree line at the far edge of the frame, the trainees assembled in their white shirts and dark shorts. Then Parcher walking toward Brick Hamilton in his full Navy uniform, badge catching the light, leaning in, the 2-second exchange, Brick's nod, the corner of his mouth. Then, the drill. Parcher's attorney objected during the playback. Voice measured, language careful. He argued the footage was ambiguous, that the pre-drill exchange could have been any instruction, that nothing in the video demonstrated discriminatory intent. The panel chair asked for the footage to be played again. Then a third time. After the third viewing, the panel chair made a note and did not respond to the attorney. Danica Opstal's written statement was read into the record by Jonathan. It was precise and detailed. The pairing announcement, the pre-drill lean out on the open ground, Brick's escalation beyond drill parameters, Mac's controlled response, Parcher's expression at the end of it. Danica had found, in the weeks since Morales' meeting, that putting his name on the statement was something he could do after all. His full name appeared at the bottom. Mac read it from his chair and made a note to call Danica that evening. Then Brick Hamilton was brought in. He sat in the witness chair in civilian clothes, thicker through the middle than he'd looked on the training field, with the air of a man who had been making a calculation for several weeks and had finally arrived at his answer. He had been offered reduced disciplinary action in exchange for full cooperation. He had taken the offer. He confirmed everything. Parcher's instruction before the drill. Make it rough for the new guy. The complaint language dictated to Brick word for word by Parcher the evening after the drill while Brick sat in the office and typed. The bruises on Brick's arm, applied deliberately, at Parcher's suggestion, to support the complaint's physical injury claim. Every word of it, on the record. Kyla Delzer testified last. She sat in the witness chair with her back straight and her hands folded and spoke for 22 minutes without notes. Her account of her own removal from the academy was delivered with the precise, unflinching clarity of a former military medic describing a casualty. No drama, no performance, just the facts in the order they had happened. The pre-drill lean she had witnessed from across the field. The complaint filed afterward. 8 months of fighting a system that had already decided. When she finished, the room was completely silent. Parcher's attorney had stopped writing on his notepad. Parcher sat rigid in his chair, jaw tight, staring at the table in front of him. His attorney placed a hand on his arm. Parcher shook it off. The panel chair looked up from his notes and studied Parcher for a long, unhurried moment. Then he began to write. Gavin Foss was arrested on a Tuesday morning. Federal investigators arrived at the department building at 8:45. 2 of them, plainclothes, badges on lanyards, moving with the unhurried certainty of people who already had everything they needed and were simply completing a process. They found Foss at his desk in the HR division on the 2nd floor, coffee in hand, computer on. He didn't run. He didn't argue. He just went very still, the way people go still when the thing they have been quietly dreading finally walks through the door and introduces itself. They walked him out through the main corridor in handcuffs. A dozen uniformed officers watched from the hallway. Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. A few of them looked at the floor. One looked directly at Foss for the full length of the corridor and didn't look away. Nobody moved to help him. The charges were unlawful disclosure of sealed juvenile records and official misconduct, both carrying federal weight, both attached to a paper trail that led directly back to his login credentials, his workstation, and the timestamp that showed he had accessed Mac's record the same evening Parcher's complaint against Mac had been buried without review. 23 years in HR. Ended in a Tuesday morning walk down a corridor he would never come back to. Delphine Parcher's termination was processed the same afternoon. The federal panel's findings had been delivered to the department the previous evening. A document that used careful, precise language to describe what the evidence showed and left no room for interpretation. Parcher was formally terminated effective immediately. His pension, 22 years of it, the same 22 years the chief's office had called exemplary in a statement Mac could still recite from memory, was stripped under the federal civil rights finding. A criminal referral was forwarded to the federal prosecutor's office. Whether charges would follow was a matter of timing and process. Jonathan was confident they would. Brick Hamilton received a formal disciplinary suspension and was permanently barred from the training program. His cooperation had reduced his exposure, but not eliminated it. He would carry what he had done into every professional situation he entered for the rest of his career. Jonathan said that was probably the most accurate consequence available for a man who had chosen to be someone else's instrument. Mac said nothing when he heard that. He just nodded. The police chief submitted his resignation on Thursday. He released a 3-paragraph statement through his attorney. The first paragraph cited personal reasons. The second cited the need for the department to move forward with new leadership. The third paragraph, the one Mac read 3 times, acknowledged in careful institutional language that the department had failed to adequately review and address complaints of discriminatory conduct within its training program. It was not a full admission. Jonathan said it never would be, at this stage, with civil litigation still pending. But it was a public acknowledgement, attached to the chief's name, entered into the permanent record of the department's history. 24 hours later, Deputy Chief Sabrina Reyes was appointed interim chief. Mac had never heard her name before. That, Jonathan told him, was itself a kind of data point. She had built her career quietly, inside the department, without the political debts that the previous chief had accumulated over 2 decades. Her first public statement acknowledged departmental failure without qualification, and without the careful softening language that press offices used to make failure sound like a process issue. Her second act was a phone call. Mac was in the kitchen when it came through. Late afternoon, the light going amber through the window, the notepad with the 3 names still on the table because he hadn't moved it. Reyes identified herself and didn't use any of the formal phrases that Mac had been bracing for. She didn't talk about the department's commitment to reform or the importance of moving forward. She said, "We failed you. I want you to come back." Simple. Direct. No cushioning. Mac looked out the window for a moment. "I'll be there Monday," he said. Kyla Delzer received her reinstatement offer by certified letter on Friday. Full reinstatement to the training program, back pay covering 2.5 years, and a formal written apology from the department signed by Interim Chief Reyes personally. Jonathan called Mac when the letter was confirmed delivered. "She accepted," he said. "Good," Mac said. "She told me to tell you something." A brief pause. "She said she has 8 years of unfinished business." Mac smiled. It was a small smile, quiet, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and doesn't need an audience. He set his phone down on the kitchen table beside the notepad. For the first time since he had sat in that parking lot on day 3, reading the complaint that had started all of this, the table didn't feel like a place where he was working against something. It felt like a place where something had been finished. The ceremony was short. Interim Chief Sabrina Reyes stood at the front of a room on the 2nd floor of the main precinct building. Not the Academy Annex, the main building, which Mac noted and understood, with 3 journalists present, including Pammy Oliver, who had her recorder on the table and her notebook open, and was trying, not entirely successfully, to look like she wasn't personally invested in what she was covering. There were maybe 30 people in the room. Officers, administrators. Danica Opstal, standing near the back wall in his training whites, the same plain white t-shirt and dark shorts of a trainee still working through the program, having somehow found a reason to be in a building he wasn't assigned to that afternoon. Reyes presented Mac his badge without a speech. That was deliberate, Mac understood. A speech would have been for the department. The badge, handed directly from her hand to his, in front of cameras and witnesses, with no ceremony wrapping around it to soften or reframe what it meant, that was for him. He took it. It was heavier than he expected. Not physically, just heavier. He looked at it for a moment in his palm, then clipped it to his belt. Pammy's camera clicked twice. The room cleared gradually. Handshakes, brief words, people moving back toward their days. Danica caught Mac's eye across the room and gave him a single nod. Mac returned it. They would talk properly later. Right now, there was something Mac needed to do alone, and Danica seemed to understand that without being told. Jonathan was the last one in the room besides Mac. His father stood by the window with his hands in his pockets, watching the parking lot below, giving Mac the space of the moment without leaving it. When the last person filed out and the door closed, he turned. They looked at each other. There were no words available that were large enough for what the last several weeks had been, and Jonathan Werden had spent 30 years learning that the attempt to find those words usually diminished the thing you were trying to describe. So he crossed the room and put his hand briefly on the back of his son's neck, the same gesture he had used when Mac was 12 years old and sitting in the back seat of a car on Meridian Avenue, watching the world reveal itself for what it was. Then he let go. "I'll see you at dinner," Jonathan said. "Yeah," Mac said. "You will." The Academy Annex was a 10-minute drive. Mac parked in the same spot he had used on day one. Not intentionally, just the first space available on the left side of the lot. He sat in the car for a moment the way he had that first morning, looking at the brick building, the narrow windows, the flag on its pole. The building looked the same. It was not the same. He was not the same. He got out of the car and walked inside. The hallway was quiet in the late afternoon. Doors closed, lights on in a few offices, the distant sound of voices from somewhere deeper in the building. He walked without hurrying, without looking into the offices he passed, until he reached the rear exit at the end of the corridor. He pushed it open. The training field was empty. The late sun sat low behind the tree line, sending long shadows out across the pale dirt and scrubbed grass. The field looked different now than it had that afternoon under the full glare of a summer day. Softer, the colors muted, the hard edges gone. The trees at the far boundary stood quiet and still. A faint wind moved through the upper branches and stopped. Mac walked to the center of the field and stood still. He looked at the ground beneath his feet. This exact patch of earth. This was where Brick Hamilton had gone down 3 times, while trainees in white stood at the edges and said nothing. This was where Parcher's jaw had tightened and a decision had been made. This was where a decade-long machine had shown its first visible crack, because one person had refused to give it what it needed to keep running. He crouched and pressed one hand flat against the ground. The dirt was dry and firm under his palm. He held it there for a moment, then stood. He thought about Ryden Oliver, somewhere out of state with no forwarding address. He thought about Trevor Flaherty, who had a family and a job he couldn't afford to lose and had made the only choice available to him. He thought about Kyla Delzer, who had 8 years of unfinished business and was coming back to finish it. He thought about Danica, standing against the back wall this afternoon in his training whites, still showing up every morning, still doing the thing even when the thing was hard. He thought about the next person who would walk out onto this field on their first day. Someone he would never meet beforehand. Someone who didn't know his name. Someone who would come in with a plan and a purpose, and no reason yet to expect what was waiting. That person would walk into a different program than the one Mac had walked into. Not a perfect one, not a fixed one, but different. That was the thing he had come here to confirm. He stood in the center of the field in the fading afternoon light, and felt, for the first time without qualification, that it had been worth it. Not the easy worth it, the real kind, The kind that costs something and stays with you. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Danica? First day back tomorrow? Mac looked around the empty field one last time. The long shadows, the still tree line, the pale dust where the ground had been packed smooth by years of people doing hard things. He typed back. First day. He walked to the door, pushed it open, and stepped into the corridor. Behind him, the door swung shut. Ahead of him, the hallway stretched forward, bright and open. Mac Werden walked toward it. If you enjoyed the story, leave a like to support my channel and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. On the screen, I have picked 2 special stories just for you. Have a wonderful day.